Stage 36 in the Cambridge Latin course is entitled Recitatio, and it's concerned with the way certain ancient authors sought to gain an audience for their literary works through a kind of public performance. The writer who will appear in our story is a man named Marcus Valerius Martialis, usually known in English simply as Martial. Martial was from Spain. He was active at Rome at the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd AD, and his name is associated with 12 books of epigrams, short poems on a variety of topics, many of them intended to be funny. In the dialogue that begins on page 16, we'll find Martial reading a selection of these poems in front of an audience that's not being particularly cooperative. The poems are the only thing here that Martial actually wrote. The dialogue is written around them to give you some idea of what these public recitations could be like. In this video, I'm going to focus on the italicized section at the beginning of the dialogue and talk about the new grammar that's introduced in this chapter, the present tense of the subjunctive mood. We've already seen the imperfect tense of the subjunctive in Latin, and we know some of the things that it's used to do. For example, it's used all the time in purpose clauses to explain why people did things. Here are two examples. The soldiers gathered at the headquarters. Milites ad principia convenerunt. Why did they do that? Ut agricolam audirent, so that they might hear Agricola. It says they actually did gather there. That's the indicative mood, third person plural. But audirent is subjunctive because we don't know if Agricola ever showed up. We don't know if they did hear him. We simply know that the reason they gathered was so they could, so they might. And could and might and would are words we use to convey the subjunctive in English. The second example works the same way. Per totam noctem laborabat medicus ut vulnera militum sanaret, right? So the medicus was working. He was actually working per totam noctem all night. Why did he do that? Ut vulnera sanaret, so that he might treat the soldiers' wounds, so that he could cure the soldiers' wounds. We're not sure if he did. We're not sure if he got around to all of them. This sentence, this clause simply explains why he worked all night. As we saw last year, the imperfect subjunctive is extremely easy to form and to recognize. It's just the infinitive form of the verb with person markers added, right, to indicate person and number. So audire, to hear, becomes ut audirent. Sanare, to heal, becomes ut sanaret. Audirent is plural because the soldiers, well, there's more than one of them. Sanaret is singular because there's just one doctor. Boom, that's all you need to know for the imperfect subjunctive, which is why it was easy to learn. The rule for forming the present subjunctive is just as simple. You just take the stem vowel, the vowel that precedes the personal endings, and you change it. So portat becomes portet. Portant becomes portent. Now, since there are 4 conjugations of the regular verb in Latin, each with its own characteristic stem vowel, we have to learn 4 rules for changing the indicative to the subjunctive. In the first conjugation, the A becomes an E. In the second conjugation, the E becomes EA. In the third conjugation, I's and U's become A. And in the fourth conjugation, I's and IU become IA. There's a mnemonic that people use to remember the vowels of the 4 conjugations in the subjunctive. Think of this as the every good boy does fine, or the please excuse my dear Aunt Sally of Latin. We fear a liar, where the E in we represents the first conjugation, the EA of fear represents the second, the A represents the third, and the IA of liar represents the fourth. There it is, all color-coded. If you fear friars more than liars, you can do that too. Now, the present subjunctive does all the things that we saw the imperfect subjunctive do last year. For example, it appears in purpose clauses. Here's our italicized section from the beginning of the dialogue on page 16. In auditorio expectant multi cives. In the auditorium, many citizens are waiting. Why are they there? Ad sunt. They are there ut Valerium Martialem poetam notissimum recitantem audiant. They are there so they might hear, so that they can hear Valerius Martialis, the famous poet, reciting. Now, if we stopped right there, we wouldn't know whether Martial ever showed up, whether they ever heard him. Ut audiant simply explains why they are present, why they have gathered in the auditorium. If we describe the same situation in the past, by changing the tense of the main verb ad sunt to ad erant, we'll see the same kind of sentence we constantly saw last year. They were there ut martialem audirent, right, using the imperfect subjunctive. Now, while they're waiting, they're talking amongst themselves. Omnes inter se colloquuntur. Then suddenly, signum datur, a signal is given, ut taceant. Now, tacere is a second conjugation verb meaning to be silent. So the signal that was given so that they might be silent. Ut taceant. We don't know if they obeyed the signal and became silent or whether they kept talking. We simply know that the signal was actually given so that they would. The purpose of the signal was that they be silent. And here, tacent, they are silent, becomes taceant, just as audiunt, as the indicative before, becomes audiant in this ut clause, in this purpose clause. Okay, we continue in the indicative mood, describing stuff that's actually happening. Auditorium intrat poeta ipse, the poet himself enters the auditorium. Okay, and the last sentence begins with an ablative absolute. Remember those? Auditoribus plaudentibus, with the audience members applauding. Martialis scaenam ascendit, he ascends the stage. Ut versus suos recitet, so that he might recite his verses. Now, recitet is the subjunctive of recitat. So again, the A became an E to indicate that this is the subjunctive in a purpose clause explaining why Martial ascended the stage, not whether or not he actually recited his verses. As we'll see when we read the dialogue, he's going to have some difficulty actually reciting his verses in front of this audience, but now we know why he's up there. Anyway, these present tense subjunctive forms, like the imperfect tense forms we saw last year, are pretty easy to recognize just from the context in which they occur. All of these occur in purpose clauses introduced by ut. So, ut audiant, ut taceant, ut recitet. But the vowel of the subjunctive will depend on the conjugation that the verb belongs to, and that, again, is where this we fear a liar device comes into play. Audire is a fourth conjugation verb, so that the subjunctive becomes audiant, like liar. Tacere is a second conjugation verb, so that taceant, tacent becomes taceant, and recitare is a first conjugation verb, so that recitat becomes recitet. We'll mostly encounter these present subjunctive forms in dialogue, and in fact, if we had been learning to speak Latin rather than simply read it, you would have encountered them a long time ago. They're not difficult. You'll get used to them. Like most grammatical details in the language, you'll think about these rules mostly when you're confused and you're looking for clarification. Context usually makes clear what the main verb of a sentence is. That's all for now. Y'all take care, and we'll talk about this in the Zoom meeting tomorrow.